Orlando International Airport, November 18, 2024. It was supposed to be a routine Monday morning at Orlando International Airport, but for one passenger, it turned into a spectacle worthy of its own reality TV episode. The clock struck 9:30 a.m. when chaos erupted at Gate 34 of Frontier Airlines. A woman, visibly distressed and lacking her ID, found herself barred from boarding her flight. Instead of calmly addressing the issue, she launched into a loud tirade, accusing airport staff of negligence and insisting she had paid $189 to bypass the TSA process. What began as a disagreement quickly escalated into a full-blown meltdown that drew the attention of travelers, staff, and eventually the airport police. Little did anyone know, this incident would spiral into a comedic yet cautionary tale of what not to do when your travel plans go awry. It all started innocently enough on a balmy Monday morning at Orlando International Airport. Travelers shuffled through security lines, clutching their passports and boarding passes with sleepy resignation. Amid this sea of quiet compliance emerged a woman who appeared as though she'd been summoned directly from a reality TV audition for most dramatic meltdowns. Approaching the TSA checkpoint with the confidence of a sovereign ruler, she slammed her oversized tote bag onto the conveyor belt and announced, "I paid $189 to skip TSA." Her voice reverberated through the terminal like a battle cry, startling the already under-caffeinated passengers. She glanced around, seeking approval, but found none. A TSA officer, a veteran of countless holiday rushes and toddler tantrums, calmly informed her, "Ma'am, without a valid ID, you can't board your flight." This simple statement was met with a sharp intake of breath, as though she'd just been told the sun wouldn't rise tomorrow. "What do you mean no ID? I have everything else. My phone, my debit card, my Costco membership. And I paid $189 to skip TSA." She repeated, louder this time, gesturing wildly as if the sheer volume of her words might transform reality. The TSA officer blinked, unshaken. "Mom, we can do a secondary screening if you don't have ID, but you'll need to cooperate." "Cooperate?" she sneered, her hands on her hips. "Oh, honey, I'm more than cooperating. I'm enlightening y'all about your failures as airport employees." Her performance began to draw an audience, fellow passengers, who moments earlier had been scrolling through their phones or sipping lukewarm coffee, started to take notice. Some exchanged amused glances, others subtly filmed her with their phones. A toddler nearby clapped, perhaps mistaking her outburst for an impromptu puppet show. When asked to step aside to avoid holding up the line, the woman refused, planting her feet like a protester at a sit-in. "I'm not moving until someone fixes this," she declared, her voice escalating to operatic levels. "Do you think this is how you treat paying customers by now?" Whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone speculated she might be a performance artist testing the limits of public patience. Another joked she was auditioning for a Frontier Airlines commercial title, "When you don't pay for priority boarding." As airport staff scrambled to manage the growing scene, one thing became clear: this was no ordinary travel hiccup. This was the prelude to a saga that would soon make national headlines and leave countless airport employees questioning their career choices. The shouting had reached such a crescendo that travelers in distant terminals paused mid-pretzel bite, wondering if someone had discovered a long-lost dinosaur in the airport lounge. Within minutes, a pair of airport police officers appeared on the scene, cutting through the growing crowd with calm authority. "Ma'am, we're here to help," one officer began, his tone as neutral and composed as a yoga instructor leading a beginner's class. The woman whipped around to face him, her expression a mix of indignation and triumph, as if she'd been waiting for this moment all her life. "Oh, now you want to help," she snapped, her voice pitched somewhere between a fire alarm and a karaoke performance gone wrong. The officer took a deep breath. "We understand you're upset, but we need you to calm down so we can figure this out together." "Calm down," she echoed, clutching her chest in mock disbelief. "I have been mistreated, humiliated, and ignored. Do you even know what it's like to pay $189 for TSA pre-check and be treated like I'm invisible, like I don't exist?" Behind her, a man muttered to his wife, "I wish she didn't exist right now." The second officer, younger and slightly less experienced, tried a different approach. "Ma'am, let's step over here so we can talk." "Step over here," she scoffed, planting herself in the center of the terminal like a human roadblock. "I'm not going anywhere until someone fixes this mess." Her arms flailed dramatically, narrowly missing a nearby passenger who ducked just in time. She pointed accusingly at everyone in sight: to TSA agent who had dared enforce rules, to gate agent who had the audacity to exist, and, inexplicably, a janitor sweeping up popcorn a few feet away. "All of you, you're all in on this. This is a conspiracy to ruin my day." The crowd, now fully invested in the unfolding spectacle, stifled chuckles. Someone in the back whispered, "This is better than Netflix." Another pulled out snacks, as though the scene was a free, unscheduled entertainment event. The woman wasn't finished. "And don't you dare think I don't know my rights," she bellowed, now addressing the officers directly. "I am being discriminated against. This is a violation of my my constitutional rights." "Yes, those." The older officer exchanged a glance with his partner, who looked as though he might bolt for the nearest exit, if given half the chance. "Ma'am, nobody here is trying to violate your rights. We just need to resolve this calmly." The calm was not in her repertoire. "Do you know what discrimination looks like?" she continued, pacing now like a trial lawyer delivering closing arguments. "It looks like this. Me, a woman who paid good money to get through this nonsense quickly, being treated like a criminal just because I forgot my ID." The pacing turned into stomping. A stray suitcase wheel caught the edge of her path, sending her stumbling slightly. She recovered with a flourish, waving off assistance from a concerned onlooker as if she'd been affronted by the mere suggestion of help. "You think I'm going to let this slide?" she shrieked, pointing a finger so close to the younger officer's chest he instinctively leaned back. "This is America, and I am entitled to." Before she could finish, a loudspeaker overhead announced, "Attention passengers, Frontier Flight 237 to Denver has now departed." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the audience. But for the woman, this was the ultimate betrayal. She froze, then turned to the gate, shaking her fists at the closed door as though sheer rage might summon the aircraft back. "Are you kidding me?" she screamed. "You let it leave without me? This is a hate crime. I'm calling my lawyer." The officers exchanged another look. The older one reached for his radio. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if you don't cooperate, we're going to have to ask you to leave the airport." Her eyes narrowed, her defiance hardening like a shield. "Oh, I'm not leaving. I'm going to stand here until someone fixes this, or until I own this airport." The crowd, now fully captivated, braced for what they knew was inevitable, the arrest-worthy crescendo of this airborne drama. The woman, now fully immersed in her one-woman crusade, stood like a warrior defending the last bastion of justice, or, in this case, her own distorted version of it. Her monologue continued, looping back to the $189 fee, which had now become the tragic centerpiece of her ordeal. "You think you can just take my money and ban me from TSA without paperwork?" she exclaimed, pacing dramatically. "I want it in writing, right now." She punctuated this demand by slamming her fist onto the counter, startling a gate agent who was silently praying for her shift to end. A bemused passenger in the back whispered, "Does she think this is Judge Judy?" The older officer sighed and stepped forward, speaking with the measured calm of someone who had defused far worse situations. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but verbal directives are standard in cases like this. You've been informed, and we're asking you again to cooperate." But she was having none of it. "Standard? Oh, no. Not with me," she retorted, pointing a dramatic finger. "I know my rights. You can't just ban me from TSA like I'm some sort of criminal. I've watched enough courtroom dramas to know this is unconstitutional." Her voice rose again, this time louder than the announcement system, which was calmly advising other passengers to proceed to Gate 12 for their boarding. She turned to the crowd, now firmly in her imagined role as the protagonist of a legal thriller. "Do you all see this? This is what happens when you trust the system." A few passengers chuckled nervously, while others exchanged looks of disbelief. Someone muttered, "She's gonna start quoting the Constitution next." As if on cue, she pivoted back to the officers. "First Amendment, freedom of speech. That means I can say whatever I want, however loud I want." She jabbed her finger into the air for emphasis, her gestures growing increasingly wild. The younger officer stepped forward cautiously, his hands open in a gesture of placation. "Ma'am, exercising your rights doesn't mean disrupting airport operations." You need to leave the premises, or we'll have no choice but to escort you out. Escort me out, she scoffed, her voice dripping with indignation. This is a public space. I have every right to be here, especially when you've wronged me. Do you hear me? Wronged. At this point, her pacing turned into a full theatrical march, complete with exaggerated arm swings and pointed glares at everyone within a 10-foot radius. Where's the supervisor? I demand a supervisor. No. Wait, a manager. And not just any manager. I want the head of TSA here. The crowd, now fully entertained, began whispering among themselves. A woman with a toddler remarked, "This is better than reality TV." Another man quietly filmed the spectacle on his phone, undoubtedly planning to upload it later under the title Karen vs. TSA, The Ultimate Meltdown. The officers maintained their professionalism, though the younger one's expression betrayed growing frustration. The older officer, clearly seasoned in the art of patience, tried again. "Ma'am, we've given you every opportunity to resolve this peacefully. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." But peacefully wasn't part of her vocabulary. Harder. Oh, I'll show you harder. She snapped, planting herself firmly in the center of the terminal like an immovable statue of defiance. "You think you can intimidate me with your badges and authority? I'm not scared of you." As she crossed her arms, her gaze burning with self-righteous fury, a toddler nearby mimicked her stance, arms folded and lips pursed. The beau's mother tried to suppress a laugh, while others in the crowd chuckled openly. "Laugh all you want," the woman shouted at the spectators. "You'll all see when I win this in court." The older officer exchanged a glance with his partner. He reached for his radio. "This is escalating," he murmured. "We may need backup." The woman, catching sight of the radio, launched into another tirade. "Backup? Oh, so now you're calling in reinforcements. You think I'm some kind of threat? This is exactly what I'm talking about, targeted harassment." Her dramatic performance crescendo as she waved her arms wildly, accidentally knocking over a nearby suitcase. "And another thing, this is a violation of my human rights. I've seen documentaries about this sort of thing. This is how it starts." At this point, the janitor, still quietly sweeping in the corner, paused, his expression unreadable. Perhaps he was wondering if sweeping popcorn crumbs was truly the most chaotic task in his job description. The scene, now teetering on the edge of farce, seemed destined for an explosive finale. All that remained was for the officers to decide when and how to end the show. The arrest, like a storm cloud brewing all afternoon, was as inevitable as a delayed flight announcement. By this point, the protagonist had transformed from an irate traveler into a full-blown one-woman Broadway production. She stood with her arms raised in mock surrender, her voice a symphony of indignation. "I'm a mother, a daughter, a sovereign citizen of these United States," she declared, her tone oscillating between defiance and theatrical despair. The officers moved cautiously, as though approaching a cornered raccoon, not because they felt threatened, but because they knew every move would be scrutinized and narrated in excruciating detail. "Ma'am, please turn around," the older officer said firmly, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Oh, so this is how you treat law-abiding taxpayers?" she exclaimed, clutching her chest as though mortally wounded by injustice. "Do you have any idea who I am?" The younger officer exchanged a glance with his partner, his expression unreadable. "No, Mom, but we're about to find out," he replied, his voice tinged with the kind of exasperation that only comes from hours of dealing with unreasonable people. As they gently guided her arms behind her back, she twisted dramatically, making the process take twice as long. "Be careful," she barked. "I have a shoulder injury from CrossFit. If you dislocate it, I will sue." The crowd had grown, passengers openly filming with their phones like paparazzi at the celebrity meltdown. "World star," someone shouted, eliciting laughter from the onlookers. "You're all complicit in this," the woman yelled, swiveling her head like a furious owl. "Every single one of you. Sitting there, watching while my civil liberties are stripped away." She turned her attention back to the officers as they clicked the handcuffs into place. "This is unconstitutional," she screamed, stomping her foot like a toddler denied candy. "My ancestors are watching," a young man in the crowd muttered. "They're probably watching ... and cringing." The older officer, still calm but visibly weary, said, "Ma'am, you're being detained for disorderly conduct and trespassing. Let's make this easier for everyone and head outside." But she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Trespassing, trespassing. She repeated, dragging out the syllables as if they were foreign and offensive. How can I be trespassing in an airport? Do you even understand how airports work? This is public property. The officers began to escort her toward the exit, but she resisted by planting her feet firmly on the ground. I'm not leaving until I get an apology and a refund for the $189. She shouted, as though this amount had now transcended monetary value and become a sacred artifact. Ma'am, you've been asked to leave multiple times, the younger officer said through clenched teeth. You're refusing to comply, which is why we're escorting you out. Escorting me, she repeated with mock incredulity. No, you're kidnapping me. That's what this is, kidnapping. And guess what? I'm filming this too. She glanced around frantically, realizing her phone was nowhere in sight. Where's my phone? Did you steal it? The janitor, still sweeping nearby, finally spoke up, his voice dry and unamused. It's on the counter where you left it while yelling about your First Amendment. Her face turned red, but she recovered quickly. Well, good. Everyone needs to see how corrupt this system is. As they neared the automatic doors, she upped the ante. This isn't over. You'll hear from my lawyer, and my mother. She's in Florida, but she fly here if she has to. The officers maintained their composure as they gently guided her through the doors. Once outside, she tried one last act of rebellion, dropping to the ground in what she must have imagined was a dignified sit-in protest. Instead, it looked more like a stubborn child refusing to leave a playground. You're violating my rights, she cried from her makeshift seat on the pavement. You'll all be held accountable for this. My story will be on the news, and everyone will know the truth. The younger officer sighed deeply, looking up at the sky as though questioning his life choices. Ma'am, you're under arrest. If you don't get up, we'll have to carry you. Fine, she snapped, scrambling to her feet, but making it look like her idea. But let the record show, this is an injustice of epic proportions. As she was led toward a waiting police car, the crowd began to disperse, some passengers chuckling, others shaking their heads in disbelief. One older man turned to his wife and said, "That was better than the in-flight movie." The woman, still shouting as the car doors closed, gave her final, impassioned proclamation. You'll regret this. I'll see you all in court. Somewhere. Perhaps, her ancestors truly were watching. But instead of righteous pride, they were likely whispering, maybe we'll sit this one out. Seated on the hard bench of a holding cell, the woman still wore an air of indignant defiance, though her earlier fire had dimmed to embers. You're squeezing my arm. This will be in court. She had shouted during the ride to the precinct, despite the fact that the officers had followed procedure with textbook precision. Her voice echoed through the confined space of the transport vehicle, bouncing off the indifferent silence of her surroundings. Now, with her tirade winding down, she tapped her fingers on the bench, staring at the peeling paint of the cell walls as if willing them to transform into the courtroom where she would eventually clear her name. Do you even know what trespassing means? She muttered, half to herself, half to the officer on duty, who sat at his desk scribbling on a clipboard. Her dramatic journey had not ended in the applause she imagined, but in a quiet holding room, the hum of fluorescent lights replacing the cacophony of the terminal. The officer at the desk barely acknowledged her, his focus trained on paperwork, though the corner of his mouth twitched a hint of amusement perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion. As the minutes ticked by, the woman began to replay the events in her mind, her internal monologue shifting from righteous indignation to a vague unease. $189, she whispered, the number taking on a strange, almost surreal quality. All I wanted was to skip TSA. Her words hung in the air, a quiet concession to the absurdity of the day. A low chuckle from a nearby officer startled her. He hadn't said a word since she arrived, but now spoke with a tone that was equal parts bemusement and pity. Ma'am, I've seen people get worked up over missed flights, but you've set a new bar. Was it worth it? She snapped her head toward him, ready to launch another tirade, but the words caught in her throat. For a fleeting moment, she hesitated, her bravado faltering. I was defending my rights, she said finally, though the conviction in her voice had dulled. Sure, the officer replied, raising an eyebrow. But maybe next time, consider staying calm. Could have saved you a lot of trouble and, you know, an arrest record. Her face tightened, but she said nothing. instead crossing her arms and leaning back against the cold wall. The reflection she avoided earlier now crept in like an uninvited guest. The endless yelling, the melodramatic declarations, the futile demands for written proof, it all replayed in her mind, this time with an undertone of regret. And yet, her stubborn streak refused to go quietly. "I'm still calling my lawyer," she announced to no one in particular, her voice echoing faintly in the empty room. Meanwhile, back at the airport, her meltdown had already taken on a life of its own. Videos of her shouting about her rights and the infamous $189 were circulating online, complete with captions like, "When you pay for TSA pre-check but forget your ID, social media, as it does," had transformed her 15 minutes of airport fame into an endless loop of memes, parodies, and hashtags. Unbeknownst to her, the clip of her defiant cry, "My ancestors are watching," had gone viral, with one creative user editing it into a slow-motion montage set to a dramatic orchestral score. Another had photoshopped her into historical paintings, standing alongside George Washington, clutching her non-existent boarding pass. In the quiet of her cell, she remained oblivious to her internet infamy. "When's my lawyer getting here?" she asked impatiently, interrupting the officer's thoughts. "Soon," he replied without looking up. "Try to relax." Relax? The word sounded foreign to her, like a suggestion meant for someone else. Still, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving only a dull ache in her shoulders and a nagging voice in her head asking whether any of this was truly worth it. As the hours passed and the reality of her situation sank in, the woman sat quietly, no longer railing against injustice or muttering about refunds. Somewhere in her mind, a thought surfaced, uninvited but persistent. Next time, maybe a little less yelling and a little more planning. Meanwhile, the internet buzzed on, immortalizing her day of chaos for strangers to laugh at, comment on, and forget long before her next flight. In the end, the dramatic incident at the airport was not just a story about a woman missing her flight, but also a lesson in how we face adversity. Amid the arguments, shouting, and blame, the one thing she never mentioned was two simple words: stay calm. Perhaps, if she had taken a moment to breathe deeply, listen to the staff's instructions, or even accept that mistakes are sometimes unavoidable, the story might have had a different ending. The lesson here is not just for her but for all of us. Life constantly throws unexpected and unpleasant situations our way, but how we respond makes all the difference. Instead of letting emotions take over, we should choose calmness, patience, and respect for others. Frustration is natural, but it doesn't need to turn into a public spectacle. After all, missing a flight may be a temporary inconvenience, but losing one's composure and dignity is the true costly price to pay.